All right, so we've been going through Bible survey, starting in Genesis and making our way. Do we call it Bible survey? We'll call it Bible survey. Yeah. Hit Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, made our way all the way down through Chronicles, and Ezra and Nehemiah were last week. And we learned, well, starting in Chronicles, we hit the point where the Babylonian captivity happened. The nation of Judah was taken into captivity in Babylon, where we see Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. They're taken and they're put in a high position, or they're put into a position and trained to be great leaders in Babylon. But they retained their moral conscience during that whole time, where they were seeking to honor God with all of it. And then we hit the point in Daniel, it was Daniel chapter 5, where we see the handwriting on the wall of the end of the Babylonian Empire. They lasted about 70 years, which, I don't know, I was reading that last night, and I was like, that seems outrageously short for a nearly worldwide empire. But sure enough, 70 years, and the nation of Babylon falls to the Medo-Persians, and King Darius, the Persian king, takes over. And we see him in the book of Daniel as well. He was the one who was in charge during the time of that whole lion's den incident. And then he also, let me make sure, I need to double check that fact real quick before I say it with the utmost confidence. See, it's a good thing I double-checked. Cyrus, Darius, two different people, if I remember correctly, right? Not another Israeli name versus okay. All right. So, Darius is no longer in charge. Cyrus allows for the return of the Jews. The Persians didn't care so much when it came to the nations that the Babylonians had taken, and so we start to see these nations allowed to leave Babylon and return to the lands that they're from. So Ezra and Zerubbabel go back to, along with a large segment of the nation of Israel, to rebuild Jerusalem. Well, not Jerusalem in its entirety at this point. They just start with the temple. And so they start to get the framework of the temple laid out, and we studied that a little bit when we were in Ezra. And after that, we hit a weird break where there's a gap in the middle of the book of Ezra, around the chapter 6. And there's a time where they're not finishing the building of the temple. And I say "and" a lot, so I'm going to try and cut that while we're in the middle of it.
Rex can just scream every time.
Yeah, why don't you do that for me, Rex? Just flick something at me, you know. But gap in the middle of the book of Ezra where the Jews were not rebuilding the temple all the way, and we have a number of prophets towards the end of the minor prophets there. Let me make sure I get those right. Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi all are talking to the Jews at that time who are not rebuilding the temple and not doing what the Lord is after. In the middle of all that, we get the book of Esther, taking place back in the capital city of the Persians, Susa. Not Susa, Susa. And again, wow. I'm going to not interrupt myself when I do that, though. Otherwise, this is going to be a long lesson otherwise. So, we make it all the way to the book of Esther, and we go back to Susa. The Jews were supposed to leave. They were supposed to go back, but obviously not all of them did. It was the responsibility of Daniel, for instance, said, hey, return back to the homeland. Isaiah said, once this 70 years is up, let's go back to the homeland. Make sure you go back to Israel when it's time to go back to Israel. And people being people, the Israelites were very successful in the land of Babylon. They did very well for themselves. They did very well for themselves under the Persian rule as well. So when the time came for them to go back and to rebuild, a lot of them said, but I got a good thing going over here, so I'm going to just stick around for a little bit and stay in the land. What was that book that you had? I should have brought it with me just so I could hold it up, but We picked it up in Draper at not the Lighthouse bookstore anymore, but Christian Research Center up in Draper there. And if you get the opportunity, head up there. But we picked up a book on the times and the peoples of just all throughout Bible history, and they had a huge section, and it's just like, look, a lot of people were doing really well at the time, and so they didn't return to Israel. And the book of Esther covers two of those people. So if we come to the beginning of the book of Esther, chapter 1, verse 1, now in the days of Ahasuerus, the Ahasuerus who reigned from India to Ethiopia over 127 provinces, in those days when King Ahasuerus sat on his throne in Susa, the capital, in the 3rd year of his reign, he gave a feast for all of his officials and servants, the army of Persia and Media, and the nobles and governors of the provinces were before him. While he showed the riches of his royal glory and the splendor and pomp of his greatness for many days, 180 days, and when these days were completed, the king gave for all the people present in Susa, the citadel, both great and small, a feast lasting for 7 days in the court of the garden of the king's palace. So we have this massive party going on. Herodotus tells us that in his history of the time that he had just come back from defeating the Egyptians, and so things are going pretty well for him. He's got this he just throws a massive party. Wine is flowing freely. It says down in verse 8 that everyone was drinking according to this edict. There is no compulsion. You could drink as much or as little as you want. Just huge party showing off opulence, wealth. The whole point of it was just to say, look at me, I am great, which seems to be a very big habit of kings at the time, whether it was the Babylonians or the Persians or even some of the Jewish kings. But a party that lasted 180 days is 365 divided by, carry the 1. That's like a lot of a year. 6 months, thank you. I'm glad Andy paid attention in math class, because I sure didn't. And then at the end of this, it gets to the point where he kind of says, you know what? Let's throw an additional party for another 7 days. And it's just going to be another absolutely fantastic party. And it's during this time where the king has had a lot to drink. It says on the 7th day in verse 10, on the 7th day, when the heart of the king was merry with wine, he commanded Mehuman, Biztha, Harbona, Bigtha, and Agatha, Zephyr, and Carcass, the 7 eunuchs who served in the presence of King Ahasuerus, to bring Queen Vashti before the king in her royal crown, in order to show the peoples and the princes her beauty, for she was lovely to look at. But Queen Vashti refused to come at the king's command, and delivered by the eunuchs, refused to come at the king's command delivered by the eunuchs. At this, the king became enraged, and his anger burned within him. So we have this bit of a situation. Typically, you don't want to tell the king no. And in Persia especially, obviously, the king has little regard for, there's just little regard given for his wives, plural. I mean, Ahasuerus, according to history, was very much, he had many wives and concubines, so much so that they make a point of saying that he was like more so than most other kings. Very much like Solomon, where he just, what's the word I'm looking for? He was very much like Solomon in the fact that he just kept bringing women into his harem constantly. And so at this, he had very little regard for just women in general. And so he says, come down here. He wants her to put on a show. We don't know exactly what was going on there, if there was any subtext or anything like that. A lot of people have a lot of things to say. We won't read too much into it because it's kind of hard to know for sure. But the queen didn't care to be a part of this. She wanted to stay at the party she was throwing for the women of the palace at the time, and she did not want to come down there and display herself for all the people in the king's court. That didn't go over very well. 13, when the king said to the wise men who knew the times, for this was the king's procedure towards all who were versed in law and judgment. The men next to him, and then we're going to skip those names, except for Mecumen, he comes in a little bit later. The 7 princes of Persia and Media, who saw the king's face and sat first in the kingdom, according to the law, that what is to be done to Queen Vashti because she has not performed the command of King Ahasuerus delivered by the eunuchs. Then Mecumen said in the presence of the king and his officials, not only against the king has Queen Vashti done wrong, but also against all the officials and all the peoples who are in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus. For the queen's behavior will be made known to all the women, causing them to look at their husbands with contempt. Since they will say, King Ahasuerus commanded Queen Vashti to be brought before him, and she did not come. This very day, the noble women of Persia and Media, who have heard the queen's behavior, will say the same to all the king's officials, and there will be contempt and wrath in plenty. If it pleases the king, let a royal order go out from him, and let it be written among the laws of the Persians and the Medes, so that it may not be repealed, that Vashti is never again to come before King Ahasuerus. And then let the king give her royal position to another who is better than she. And so he sends out the order. It goes throughout the whole kingdom, basically saying, I'm in charge. I'm the big man. Nobody says no to me. The idea is pretty cut and dry right there. It's right out in the open. The thought is, if you don't get rid of Vashti, then every woman in the entire kingdom is going to rebel against her husband, and there's going to be chaos and disorder, and the whole nation's going to fall apart. It is very, very extra. But the king said, all right, this is pretty good. And a fun note, a lot of people have argued about the historicity of Esther and whether or not the book of Esther is something that was even written at the time, which, given the details of the book, are very suspect, because there's no reason to, as we look through the history of the times with King Ahasuerus, or Xerxes as he's called by in Persian. Ahasuerus was a Hebrew name given to him. But Xerxes a lot of these details that we see about life during the times really was very clearly, obviously, from the time of Esther. Like, for instance, bringing together this council of the seven men, we have records of the king Ahasuerus bringing these guys in when he was trying to figure out, hey, what do we do about Greece, for instance? Specifically, we have a report of a lot of these little details that we see throughout the entire book are just they're one-to-one to the times and the just historically accurate with the what we know about Medo-Persia at the time. It had to have been written at least fairly close to the time the events are written of. Sorry, my little ramble out of the way. And after this, we get to chapter 2, where the king suddenly realizes, hey, hold on a minute. I don't have a queen anymore, and this is a sad thing for him. And so he's got to figure out what to do. And Mecumen, the advisor who made this big hubbub earlier about this is what you should do. You should get rid of Vashti, put it into law in the Medes and Persians so it can't be repealed. King's like, man, I miss my wife. And Mecumen's like, if he reinstates his wife, she's not going to be happy with me because I was the one who, said all this stuff. So he says to the king, verse 2, then the king's young men who attended him said, let beautiful young virgins be sought out for the king, and let the king appoint officers in the provinces of the kingdom to gather all the beautiful young virgins to the harem in Susa, the capital, under the custody of Haggai, the king's eunuch, and who is in charge of the women. Let their cosmetics be given to them, and let the young woman who pleases the king be queen instead of Vashti. And this pleased the king, and he did so. So the plan was made, right? The scene is set. We've got all of our backgrounds all set in place right now, and now we can kind of get into the thick and thin of it, and we are introduced to Mordecai and Hadassah, or Esther, as she'll be known for the rest of the book. things get into play. We read about in verse 5 of chapter 2. Now there was a Jew in Susa, the citadel, whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jair, son of Shimei, son of Kish, a Benjamite, who had been carried away from Jerusalem among the captives, carried away with Jeconiah, the king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, had carried away. So he was taken away in the second round of captives, Mordecai's great-grandfather Kish. He was bringing up Hadassah, that is Esther, the daughter of his uncle, for she had neither father nor mother. The young woman had a beautiful figure and was lovely to look at, and when her father and mother died, Mordecai took her as his own daughter. So, when the king's order and his edict were proclaimed, when many young women are gathered in Susa, the citadel, in custody of Haggai, Esther was also taken into the king's palace and put in custody of Haggai, who had charge of the women. And the young women pleased him and won his favor, and he quickly provided her with her young woman pleased him and won his favor, and he quickly provided her with her cosmetics and her portion of the food, and with 7 young chosen women from the king's palace, and advanced her and her young women to the best place in the harem. Esther had not made known her or her people or her kindred, for Mordecai had commanded her not to make it known. And every day Mordecai walked in front of the court of the harem to learn how Esther was and what was happening to her. Now we're introduced to 2 main characters, and these two, this is something interesting. There's a couple of different opinions on Esther, and Jeremy pointed out back in 2018 there was a sermon series done on Esther, and so I went back and listened to a couple of those. But there's a couple different opinions in commentaries and stuff. But I think the important thing to notice is when we're reading the Bible, these are real people. Real people do things like make mistakes. They screw up. They are not perfect. If we look through the Bible, I mean, we just got done with the entire first portion of the Bible there. We're seeing things like kings who are godly, who end up making huge screw-ups that end up costing them and their children greatly. We have things like people like Abraham and Sarai who constantly make mistakes, who even though they've made those mistakes already, they go and make those mistakes again. This is a book with imperfect people. And Esther and Mordecai are both imperfect people as well. For one, they stuck around in Susa. They did not go back to Israel like the Lord had commanded them. Another thing we're going to notice very oddly, that despite the fact we see the fingerprints of a grand plan placed around the entire thing, God, not a single name of God is mentioned once. Not even El to say God, but God is not brought up once. He's alluded to at a very small point. So we know that Mordecai wasn't, completely, what's the word I'm looking for? He wasn't a completely secular man. He did have an understanding of who God was and what his plan was for Israel and what he had promised them. But not once does anybody pray. They fast. And maybe prayer was a part of that. We don't know, but it's never specified here. We have, and Esther's kind of put up as a weird contrast to Daniel as well, is another thing. Daniel gets taken in the first round of captives to Babylon at around the same time Esther's great-grandfather Kish was. He was taken in the second run of captives, but in the first run of captives, Daniel was taken. And when Daniel's taken in, he's given a portion of the king's food. He's given all these same things, a lot of the same things that Esther is given here, but him, Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah, or Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they go out of their way to say, hey, we're not going to partake in the king's food. We're not going to eat of this. Just bring us vegetables, stuff that's not, desecrated or that has pagan associations with it or violates the law. They avoid moral compromise in situations such as the fiery furnace, where they're put basically at spear point, say, you are going to die if you do not do this. They say, we are still going to not worship this idol that you've set up, Nebuchadnezzar. And they pray regularly is a huge thing. You see throughout the entire book of Daniel, during the reign of King Darius with the lion's den incident, he was thrown in there because they knew he wasn't going to compromise on his prayer life. These are things we don't see in the situation with Esther. She partakes of the king's food. She generally, in this situation, she's been inducted into the king's harem. She is going to spend a night with the king is basically what's going to end up happening here down the line. There is no objection that's made. It is an argument from silence, but I feel like to say that she did object and we just don't have note of it would probably be reading too much into the text. And there's no mention of prayer throughout the entire book. And these are all things that kind of play into the part where we see that Esther and Mordecai are not the super Jews. They're not always doing what the Lord wants. They're not even always paying attention to what he wants. But that doesn't mean God has his hands off this situation. God has ordained this situation. This may not have been, this was not ideal for anybody involved. I don't think Mordecai really wished to see his cousin or his adopted daughter carried off into the king's harem. That's not something he wanted. He sat outside the wall every single day trying to figure out what's going on with her, trying to make sure that she's being taken care of. Esther, for her part, was a Jew. She probably had one way she saw her life going. This was not that way. To be inducted into a harem, to have a roll of the dice, to see whether or not she would even become the queen. Otherwise, she just ends up being another wife or another concubine. That's not an ideal situation. That's probably not a situation she particularly cared to be in. But there's a reason behind it all, and that's going to become very clear throughout the entire book as we keep reading. Even though God is not mentioned, God is there the entire time. It's interesting, and it's a good lesson for us, if I can roll off on this tangent for a hot moment here in the middle of things. We live our lives. Do we see God? Do we get him audibly speaking to us? Do we sit there and we go, well, I have to make this decision in my life? And some people, they do seem to have that very clear inkling of where God wants them. But other times it feels like he's oddly silent. And where is he? In the entire book of Esther, it seems like he's oddly silent, despite the fact that he has laid the groundwork for the situation that's going to come up. Mordecai, for instance, wanted Esther to just keep quiet about her upbringing. We see this in verse 10. We see this in verse 20 of chapter 2. It's mentioned twice, where he says, don't mention that you're a Jew. Don't tell anyone you're Jewish. And she listens to him. She stays completely silent about the whole matter, which plays in their favor later down the line. The whole situation, even the tiny little details, and I hope you pick up on this, the tiny little details are going to play a huge part in the situation. God's laying the groundwork for a plan to save the Jews. All right, and then we get to verse 21, right? In those days, Mordecai was sitting in the king's gate. Bigthan and Teresh, two of the king's officials, this is chapter 2, verse 22. And this came to the knowledge of Mordecai, and he told it to Queen Esther. And Esther told the king in the name of Mordecai. When the affair was investigated and found to be so, both men were hanged at the gallows. And it was recorded in the book of the Chronicles in the presence of the king. Chapter 3. So now, these things are, again, more groundwork is being laid for God's plan. After these things, King Ahasuerus promoted Haman the Agagite, the son of Hammedatha, and advanced him and set his throne above all the officials who were with him. And all the king's servants who were in the king's gate bowed down and paid homage to Haman, for the king had so commanded concerning him. But Mordecai did not bow down or pay homage. And so Haman the Agagite, some people think he is the son of King Agag. Back in 1 Samuel, Saul had spared him but he didn't last very long afterwards, so I find that a little difficult to believe. In the Bible Knowledge Commentary, what was his last name, the guy who wrote that section on Esther? This is why you write stuff down. He mentioned a inscription talking about Agag being a district in Persia, although he didn't quote his sources, and which is a classic blunder with like most Bible commentaries. I did end up finding something, Nebuchadnezzar talking about a Median province being Agag. But yeah, whatever the case may be, he was probably from a place called Agag, not probably related to the Amalekite king Agag, as much as a lot of people seem to think so. I don't know. I wasn't there. I didn't ask him. So all I can do is speculate on that particular matter. I'll hold that with an open hand. You can feel free to come and fight me later about that. We get to verse 4. When they spoke to him day after, verse 3, sorry. Mordecai is at the king's gate. Then the king's servants who were at the king's gate said to Mordecai, "Why do you transgress the king's command?" And when they spoke to him day after day, they would not listen to them. They told Haman in order to see whether Mordecai would stand, for he had told them that he was a Jew. Awfully hypocritical of him, don't you think? After telling Esther, just remember, whatever you do, you're in the king's palace. Don't tell them you're a Jew. Otherwise, that could be a big issue. It could impede things. I have no idea. Just to keep that to yourself. And then the second he's pushed a little bit, it is like, oh, I'm a Jew. Nice going, Mordecai. Well, Haman was a very angry man with a lot to prove. I don't know, he might have had just like a Napoleon complex or something. He just really needed people to really acknowledge who he was. But verse 6 tells us that he didn't just want to lay hands on Mordecai. He disdained to lay hands on Mordecai alone. He sought to destroy all the Jews, the people of Mordecai, throughout the whole kingdom of Ahasuerus. Dude was so upset that Mordecai was not bowing down to him that he decided, I'm not just going to kill you. I'm not just going to kill your family. I'm going to commit genocide. It seems like a big step to take, but the Medo-Persians were very, very violent and very, they were very calloused to a lot of these things. And so Haman, of course, takes his plan to the king. He says, he doesn't spell out what it is. He says, look, okay, there's these people, right? There are those who can't be trusted. If you've seen the Veggie Tales, one of this story. Goes, their laws are different from those of every other people. They do not keep the king's laws, so that it is not to the king's profit to tolerate them. I'm on your side, king. If it pleases you, let it be decreed that they be destroyed, and I will pay 10,000 talents of silver into the hands of those who have charge of the king's business, that they may put it into the king's treasure. To give you an idea of how much gold that is, 10,000 talents comes to about 750,000 pounds of silver. And then I did the math back in 2022. Times 16 to get our ounceage, times the going rate of silver at the time, $22.62. That comes to $271,440,000 US dollars in silver. Silver prices have gone up since 2022, so now it's $350,880,000. The dude was loaded. He was willing to put down a lot of money to make sure that the Jews were no longer around. That was how much hatred had filled this man's heart. So much so that they just call him, they just say, he is the enemy of the Jews now. He's Haman, the enemy of the Jews, for pretty much the rest of the book. And so they go out and they basically say, here's the thing. Here's what you're going to do. This is the king's edict. The king gives him his signet ring to say, everything I say is the decree of the king. You may go out and send into all 127 provinces. There are Jews everywhere. This is going to cause absolute disaster. It's going to cause a lot of disaster back in back in Judah, where the walls aren't even built up anymore. Remember, during this time, while Zerubbabel and Ezra are still in Judah trying to get things put back together, and Nehemiah will go down, there's enemies there. Sanballat and Tobiah have been looking for an excuse to eradicate these people. They've been sitting there. So this basically says, here you go, here's your free ticket. This is a absolutely horrendous thing. It basically says you're going to annihilate them. Men, women, children. Once they're dead, you can take their belongings. I don't care. Get rid of these people. Statewide genocide was basically what was put into place. And not basically, that is exactly what's put into place. Verse 15 of chapter 3 says, the couriers went out hurriedly by order of the king and the decree that was issued in Susa, the citadel. The king and Haman sat down to drink, but the city of Susa was thrown into confusion. And of course, we hit chapter 4, and once Mordecai figures out what has happened, obviously he realizes his mistake. He tears his clothes. He cries aloud. Obviously, how was Mordecai supposed to know that it was going to progress this badly? And so he's out in traditional mourning garb. He's in sackcloth. He's mourning and weeping with the Jews. And Esther hears about it. And her first reaction is to say, okay, well, let's send him some clothes. Get dressed. You know, what's so bad? What's going on? She doesn't even ask what's going on. She just sends him some clothes. Mordecai sends back word to her exactly what was happening with a copy of the edict. Verse 8 says, sorry, I lost my spot there. Mordecai also gave, verse 8, a copy of the written decree issued in Susa for the destruction, that he might show it to Esther and explain it to her and command her to go to the king and beg his favor and plead with him on behalf of her people. And Hadach went and told Esther what Mordecai had said. And Esther spoke to Hadach and commanded him to go to Mordecai and say, all the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces know that if any man or woman goes to the king inside the inner court without being called, there is but one law, to be put to death, except the one to whom the king holds out the golden scepter, so that he may live. But as for me, I have not been called to come into the king these 30 days. And they told Mordecai what Esther had said. It's not looking great for her. So now she's at risk of being put in immediate danger. Basically, I haven't seen, the king has not asked for me for a month, so I don't know what his disposition towards me is right now. If I go in there, there's a good chance I don't even get to say anything. I just don't go out. Verse 12, and when they told Mordecai what Esther had said, Mordecai told them to reply to Esther, do not think to yourself that in the king's palace you will escape any more than the other Jews. For if you keep silent at this time, and this is the one part where we see Mordecai make just the tiniest hint of a reference towards God's protection for Israel. For if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place. But you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether or not you have come into the kingdom for such a time as this. So Esther told them to reply to Mordecai, go and gather all the Jews to be found in Susa and hold a fast on my behalf. And do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. And I, my young women, will also do as you do. Then I will go to the king, though as it is against the law, and if I perish, I perish. Mordecai went away and did everything as Esther had ordered him. Get to chapter 5, and Esther now enters into the presence of Ahasuerus. And when the king saw, verse 2, when the king saw Queen Esther standing in the court, she won favor in his sight, and he held out to Esther the golden scepter that was in his hand. And Esther approached to touch the tip of the scepter. And the king said to her, what is it, Queen Esther? What is your request? It shall be given to you, even up to half my kingdom. Oh, what an answer to prayer. Not only is he in a good mood, he's in a great mood. He is delighted to see her. I'll give you whatever you want. And I don't know, if someone was to say to me, hey, if I come in with a pressing matter I need addressed, and he says, I'll give you up to half my kingdom, I feel like that would be the perfect moment. I don't know if you've ever had to like engineer a situation so your parents would be more favorable to answering your request, right? Some of you know what I'm talking about. You're going, and you're like, okay, so in order for mom to be okay with me to go do this thing, I need to go in and I need to clean the house inside and out. I'm going to do all the dishes, make sure the living room's all set in place. I'll even spray some air freshener around to try and get the... She didn't have to do that. It was already perfect. The scene was set. I don't know if Esther lost her nerve or this was a better way to handle the situation. This is not the first time there will be some delay in this. But verse 4 says, and Esther says, if it pleases the king, let the king and Haman come to a feast that I have prepared for the king. Then the king said, bring Haman quickly, so that we may do as Queen Esther has asked. And so the king and Haman came to the feast that Esther had prepared, and they were drinking wine after the feast. And the king said to Esther, what is your wish? It shall be granted to you. What is your request? Even up to half of my kingdom, it will be fulfilled. And Esther said, Esther loses the nerve again. I can't blame her. I can't blame her. I would be there too. You're staring down the guy who just signed an edict that says he wants every one of your family members killed. It would be easy to lose the nerve. And God's going to use that as well. She says, if I have found favor in the sight of the king, and if it pleases the king to grant my wish and fulfill my request, let the king and Haman come to the feast that I will prepare for them, and tomorrow I will do as the king has said. And so Haman's feeling pretty great because there's not traditionally a feast with the king and the queen during that time. You could have a feast with the king. Generally, that's like a private thing. If the king and queen are having dinner, they generally don't have another house guest. Was the manner of the time. So Haman is not only like second in command, he's feeling pretty full of himself. And so verse 9 says, Haman went out that day joyful and glad of heart. But when Haman saw Mordecai in the king's gate, and he neither rose nor trembled before him. Mordecai has nerves of steel, by the way. I'm just saying, that is incredible. The order has been signed. The edict has been made. Oh, I missed an important detail back there. Shoot, we'll get back to that. The edict has been signed. The order has been sealed, and Mordecai does not care one bit. Nevertheless, Haman restrained himself and went home, and he went and brought forth his friends and his wife Zeresh, and he's like, let me tell you how great and how awesome and how, just amazing I am. He's like, he recounted to them the splendor of his riches. Remember, $350 million, $880,000 in silver alone, and that's just what he was willing to put up for the death of the Jews. He recounted to them the splendor of his riches and the number of the sons and all the promotions in which the king had honored him and how he advanced above the officials and the servants of the king. And then Haman said, even Queen Esther, let no one but me come before the king, come with the king to the feast she prepared. And tomorrow I am invited by her together with the king. Yet all this is worth nothing to me as long as I see Mordecai the Jew sitting at the king's gate. And then his wife, which... Dang, his wife is just as wicked as he is. I'll just throw that out there. His wife Zeresh and all his friends said to him, let a gallows 50 cubits high be made in the morning, and let the king, and tell the king to have Mordecai hanged on it. Then go joyfully with the king to the feast. And this pleased Haman, so he had the gallows made. Gallows at the time were not like we think Wild West gallows. You'll be hanged by the neck until... No, it's a huge spike that was placed. The idea is you would be placed on this spike and suspended up in the air, hence the word hanging, which sounds just a lot more gruesome, which it is. But this is how badly he wanted Mordecai dead, and he was willing to have a huge ornament placed above his house. But again, Esther's indecisiveness mixed with Haman's treason mixed with the king's not actually rewarding Mordecai, leads to this fantastic situation. Chapter 6, the king couldn't sleep. And so what makes you sleep more than reading something boring? So he had the book of the Chronicles of the Kings brought to him. And he was sitting there listening, and verse 2 says, and it was found written how Mordecai had told. Imagine this massive book of the Chronicles of the Kings, and somehow, some way, this section from just a couple of months before comes up to the king. It's not coincidence, obviously we know. Then the king asked, what honor or distinction has been bestowed on Mordecai for this? And the king's young men who attended said, nothing. And nothing has been done for him. The king said, who is in the court? Here's somebody out there. Now Haman had just entered the outer court of the king's palace to speak with the king about having Mordecai hanged on the gallows. This is the great part. This is the great part. That he had prepared for him. And the king's young men told him, Haman is there standing in court. The king said, let him come in. And so Haman comes in. The king says to him, what shall be done to the man whom the king wants to honor? And Haman said to himself, whom should the king delight to honor more than me? Haman said to the king, for the man the king delights to honor, let royal robes be brought, which the king has worn, and a horse the king has ridden, and the head on whose head the royal crown is set. And let the robes and the horse be handed over to one of the king's most noble officials. Let them dress the man whom the king delights in honor, and lead them on the horse through the square of the city, proclaiming before him, thus it shall be done to the man whom the king delights to honor. And the king said, hurry, take the robes and the horse, as you have said, and do so for Mordecai the Jew. Oh, I would have loved to see that. There's not much in Esther I would have loved to see, but that is up there. And then afterwards, he has to go to the feast. Just beautiful. So the dinner arrives, and now God has orchestrated this beautiful situation. The queen is in the king's utmost favor. Mordecai has been remembered by the king. And Haman has just declared genocide against these two people, and it's about to be brought to light. The king asks again, even up to half my kingdom. And Queen Esther answered, if I have found favor in your sight, O king, and if it pleases the king, let my life be granted me for my wish, and my people for my request. For if we had been sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated, if we had just been sold merely as slaves, men and women, I would have been silent. For our affliction is not compared with the loss to the king. King Ahasuerus said, who is this? Who is he? And where is he who has dared to do this? And Esther said, a foe and an enemy, this wicked Haman. And Haman was terrified before the king and queen. The king walks out. I don't know what he was doing at the time. Steps out for a second. Haman falls down next to Esther, just pleading for his life. And the king comes in and interprets that as an attack upon Esther, in which case he takes him, has his head covered and him carried off. And Harbona, one of the eunuchs in attendance with the king, verse 9, says, hey, did you know he made a gallows for Mordecai like 50 cubits high? Well, isn't that convenient? So he was hung on that. Chapter 8 goes over the fact that Mordecai and Esther come before Xerxes and say, hey, what can be done to save our people? And Xerxes basically makes a decree that says, I can't take back the genocide, but I can put in place for Jews to defend themselves. And so throughout the kingdom, 75,000 enemies of the Jews were killed, verse 16 of chapter 9. And so the Jews were saved from Haman and his scheme, and from all those enemies of the Jews who were all around. And so they declare a feast, the Feast of Purim, which comes from the word pure, which is the word for lots, which I completely forgot to mention that Haman used lots to find the day that they were going to declare the Jews were going to be all killed, which gave the Jews plenty of time during this whole plan, a month to prepare for this attack after all was said and done. It worked out. The way God had set things into place was so beautiful that even Haman's lots gave the Jews plenty of time to prepare ahead of time. And so they celebrated the Feast of Purim, verse 20. Mordecai recorded these things and sent letters to all the Jews who were in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus, both near and far, obliging them to keep the 14th day of the month Adar, and also the 15th day of the same year, year by year. That was the day on which the Jews got relief from their enemies, and the month had been turned to them for them from sorrow to gladness, from mourning into a holiday. And Mordecai was then put in a position, and oddly enough, they dug something up. I can't remember where. I'm going to have to look into that. Maybe it's another thing where nobody quoted their sources. But they found a record of Mordecai holding, or someone named with a name very similar to Mordecai, holding an office from right around this time. Just a cool little detail. But that is it, the book of Esther. A book where God is not mentioned once, prayer is not mentioned once, the people aren't perfect, but at the same time, if you read the book and somehow don't come away with this with a sense of God will protect his people, you are insane, you are foolish. And it gives us some comfort because we can look at our own lives, right? And we can say, even though I don't see you working, I don't know what's going on in the background. I don't know what these events are going to bring forward in my life. I don't know. I don't see you, but I see the effects, right? We don't see the wind, but we see the effects of the wind. So let's pray. Dear Lord, thank you for the book of Esther. Thank you for giving us just time to gather as a church and worship you. Thank you for working in ways we don't even see. Thank you for working in ways we may never see. Help us to be uniquely tuned to notice your presence and your interference with our lives and the lives of others. We pray that we would take this to heart and that we would trust in you and your promises. It's in your name we pray. Amen. Did I go over?
We're 10 minutes short.
10 minutes short. Nice. I was worried I was going over. Okay, I should have asked also, does anybody need a chart from Swindoll?
Good times.